Cheers and welcome to Bitter Reality Brewing. Yes, this is everything you never knew you needed to know about a boilover. And say that 5 times really fast. I'm gonna basically cover how to avoid, reduce, and hopefully stop or prevent a boilover. That's right. Before we jump into those sections, like, subscribe, share. Awesome, appreciate you. Now, what causes a boilover? That's something that you really need to understand first, is what causes a boilover. So during the boiling process, proteins from the malts are released and create like a layer on the very top, and they float to the top. And shockingly, which I didn't realize, there's gases in the water, which I guess I kind of realized that a little bit, and sometimes even in the malts that are released, and they help to promote that layer of protein. And as the proteins float to the top, they stick and the heat builds and it pushes it up and pushes it up. And if you can get those proteins to bind and stick to each other, they'll become heavy enough, they'll fall out of suspension. Called a hot break, or get a clean hot break, allowing you to boil your wort safely. What is wort? Just in case somebody doesn't know, that's the liquid or sugary goodness you create from all those malts. And so based on that information, this is all about breaking the surface tension of the foam and allowing the proteins, like I said, to fall out of suspension. So first of all, things that can trigger a boilover. These are things that you really should know. First, it's a Darwin Award thing. Don't boil with the lid on. Don't leave the lid on. There is an exception. There is an exception, but don't boil with the lid on. That is like asking for it, especially if you decide you want to clamp it down. We'll just say a brewing company had to come out with a warning sticker, multiple stickers about that, because obviously someone really worked hard at getting that Darwin Award. So undersized boil kettle or pot. So if your pot, and you've seen those people boiling and it's right at the very top, that's scary and takes some skill to do any kind of boil. But when the liquid's already at the top, that pot is not the correct size for that boil. It's just not, okay? Too much heat or high intensity burners, which means that most of the brewing systems, just like a burner on your stove that's electric, it applies heat. It applies heat. And it's the current. It's pulling the current back, increasing the current, reducing the current, or even turning it off and on, cycling it off and on. If you put it, excuse my language, balls to the wall and crank it full blast and your pot's yay high and it's almost full, that liquid's shooting out like a volcano, okay? So too much heat and too much intensity. I have one of the systems on here that you see me, I always have to turn it down. That's something to be aware of, okay? And like I said, there's an exception to having that lid on, which we'll talk about later. But late brewing salt additions, you've seen me do it. I like to add a lot of my alkaline additions later in the beginning of the very beginning of the boil, before we hit a boil. And things like baking soda, if you're adding that and you're already at full boil, take a little bit of liquid out, put it in there, stir it up, and then put it right back in. You're not gonna get that huge foam like you would if you just dumped it in. Same thing with hop additions. I've seen where people dump a bunch of hops in there and it comes boiling over. This is from John Blichmann. He showed me this one. You take the hops, you put them in a little Pyrex, you put the Pyrex, get some liquid in there from the beer, the wort that's boiled, stir it up, and then dump it back in. You're not gonna get that huge foam up, okay? Other types of additions can trigger it, like grains and spices that are added during the boil. Be aware of that. And shockingly, wheat. Yes, high amounts of wheat, because wheat is very high in protein, can add to that protein that floats to the top and can help trigger a boilover a little bit easier. So it's something to be aware of. If you're doing like a big Hefeweizen, something like that, be aware that you have a higher potential for a boilover than you did if you weren't doing a Hefeweizen and you were doing just like a pale ale. Okay, now that we've covered what can trigger a boilover, now we're gonna cover how to avoid, reduce, or even prevent or stop a boilover. And hopefully everybody out there, no matter how long you've been brewing, knows this one. Yes, stir. I will tell you from everything I read, all the research I did, that when you first hit your boil with that protein layer, on average, it will last 2 to 3 minutes. And I know if you're stirring, that seems like 10 to 20 minutes, but it's usually 2 to 3 minutes. Just stir, keep stirring. It should break. If it's not breaking, hey, guess what? Reduce the power, reduce the intensity of the heat being applied. Yeah, that's a number one, and a number two, back to back there. Pot size, we talked about that, having too small of a pot size. Well, having a slightly larger or elongated, some sort of additional space can help reduce, it'll start going up and it's less likely to go all the way over. It's kind of funny, Brewzilla has that add-on that you can put on top of the 35 liter, and I don't know if they have it for all of them, but that's one of the things they mention is that, hey, if you're not good at preventing boilovers, you got a little more headspace to go before it actually goes over the top. And I'm like, okay, be careful. But yeah, so things like the proper pot or kettle size definitely help. One that I use on this channel all the time, ever since I went to 240 volt to 20 volt, interchangeable word there, 5-star defoamer. A foaming control agent like 5-star defoamer, Cellar Science Foamax, Firm Cap S, I believe. There's all these different ones out there. And from everything I've read, they fall out of suspension. They're fine for home brewing. They end up with the trub. Don't worry about the little hint of silicone that's in there. It's not gonna kill you. You're gonna be just fine. And there are some concerns that it can affect your foam when you're serving your beer afterwards. No, and actually there's a lot of information and science out there saying it actually helps with the foam retention and head retention on your finished beer. It's just helping you during the boil, okay? Just during the boil. So foaming control agents. Cold water spray bottle, that's right. Takes cold, clean water, spring water, distilled, reverse osmosis. Just don't use your chlorinated or chloramine water, and don't use this bottle because this has star sand in it. But you know, just clean, cold water. It'll keep breaking that foam bubbles, and hopefully by the time you spray it a few times, it should start coagulating that protein and falling out of suspension, and hopefully then you'll be fine. Okay, we already covered this. Don't boil with the lid on. But if you're one of those people who likes to put the lid on and wait until it hits about 200 degrees, the Anvil Foundry I know will give you an alarm. I believe a lot of other systems, I believe the Grainfather does, or at least I know it used to. But hopefully your system, if you're deciding to do that, will give you an alarm at 200 Fahrenheit, and that you're listening, and hopefully you're outside in case you're not listening, that when it goes boom like a volcano, you won't have a big problem because it won't burn everybody or destroy your house. You know what I'm saying? Okay, steam condensers. Yes, a steam condenser can cause a boilover. That's where that whole lid on. So what you need to do is when you put a steam condenser on, you do it after it starts to boil. You lower the power way, even if you have to bring it way down. You can always increase it. Don't try turning it down after it's boiled over. Drop that bad boy. And on a lot of systems with the steam condenser on there, you're talking like somewhere between 40 and 60% power. If I remember right, I usually run mine around 50% power with the steam condenser on there. And don't clamp it. Do not clamp it. Just put it on, go for it, and check it, especially in the beginning. Definitely just check it in the beginning. Skimming, yes, skimming. I know Dr. Hans and David Heath have mentioned this before. I think a video like 2 years ago from Dr. Hans says, why I skim protein. Well, there's some information out there, some saying leave it alone, some saying it's okay to skim, but if you do skim it, that's going to reduce those proteins sitting up there that are going to help add to that boilover potential. So skimming will help with that. I don't know about the flavor thing. I'm pretty sure all of that falls right out of suspension anyways. Not a macro scientist or whatever you call that, where you're like analyzing every little tiny chemical response. Just not my thing. Add wort drippings. Now this is kind of like the spray bottle. It's gonna help initially, but it's not gonna prevent it unless you keep doing it, and you're only gonna have so much dripping. So if you have one of those grain baskets and it's been dripping, you can take some of that, dump it in there, dump a little bit, it'll kill the boil if you put too much, but that does help. It helps to break up the foam. Anything that breaks up the foam, that's the key here. And of course, this one's a bit of a trick, and as I say, your mileage may vary. It did save my butt at least twice that I'm aware of. Yeah. And historically, this has been around for probably hundreds of years. Wood is the best. Anything to break the bubbles, but I definitely think wood, and I believe wood is the best. You set this on top of the pot, and if the bubbles come up, they hit it and they start breaking. Keep in mind, you've got enough heat going, it doesn't matter what's on top. It's just gonna shoot over like a volcano. But it has saved my butt twice where I've seen the foam coming up to the edge. This has been sitting up there and I'm like, oh crap. And I turn the heat down, yes. And I start stirring. Now this is more of a, oh my gosh, everything's breaking loose. We've gotta save the world. Kill the power. Just kill the power. Not my recommended solution, but it is a solution. Hopefully you learned something new about everything you ever needed to know or never knew you needed to know about boilovers. That's right, home brewing boilovers. Biggest thing I'm gonna tell you, keep an eye on it, especially when you're getting up over 200 degrees. Sometimes when you hit 209, you're already at a full boil. Just keep your eye on it. You take your eye off the ball and next thing you know, you've got a problem. I've had at least, I'm gonna say at least one minor boilover every year I've been brewing, if not at least two. And I say minor because the majority have been minor ever since I've had two major ones back in the beginning, because I know better than to look away. Yeah, and every time I go, oh crap, and I mean, it just takes a second. It's kind of like a small child, just takes a second and they're into everything. Cheers, appreciate you. Don't forget, show me a little love. Cheers.